Welcome to our channel. Remember to like and subscribe to get more stories daily. Now let's get to today's story, Space Prison. Original title, The Survivors, by Tom Godwin. After 2 centuries. The sound came swiftly nearer, rising in pitch and swelling in volume. Then it broke through the clouds, tall and black and beautifully deadly, the Jern battlecruiser, come to seek them out and destroy them. Humboldt dropped inside the stockade, exulting. For 200 years his people had been waiting for the chance to fight the mighty Jern Empire. With bows and arrows against blasters and bombs. Part 2. It was early morning as Bill Humboldt sat by the fire in his cave and studied the map Craig had made of the plateau's mountain. Craig had left the mountain nameless and he dipped his pen in ink to write, Craig Mountains. Bill Delmont Anders entered very quietly, what he had to tell already evident on his face. He died last night, Bill. It was something he had been expecting to come at any time, but the lack of surprise did not diminish the sense of loss. Lake had been the last of the old ones, the last of those who had worked and fought and shortened the years of their lives that the young ones might have a chance to live. Now he was gone, now a brief era was ended, a valiant, bloody chapter written and finished, and he was the new leader who would decree how the next chapter should be written. Only 4 years older than the boy who was looking at him with an unconscious appeal for reassurance on his face. You'd better tell Jim, he said. Then, a little later, I want to talk to everyone about the things we'll start doing as soon as spring comes. You mean the hunting? Delmont asked. No more than just the hunting. He sat for a while after Delmont left, looking back down the years that had preceded that day, back to that first morning on Ragnarok. He had set a goal for himself that morning, when he left his toy bear in the dust behind him, and walked beside Julia into the new and perilous way of life. He had promised himself that someday, he would watch the Jerns die and beg for mercy as they died, and he would give them the same mercy they had given his mother. As he grew older, he realized that his hatred, alone, was a futile thing. There would have to be a way of leaving Ragnarok, and there would have to be weapons with which to fight the Jerns. These would be things impossible and beyond his reach, unless he had the help of all the others in united, coordinated effort. To make certain of that united effort, he would have to be their leader. So for 11 years he had studied and trained, until there was no one who could use a bow or spear quite as well as he could. No one who could travel as far in a day or spot a unicorn ambush as quickly. And there was no one, with the exception of George Ord, who had studied as many textbooks as he had. He had reached his first goal, he was leader. For all of them there existed the second goal, the hope of someday leaving Ragnarok and taking Athena from the Jerns. For many of them, perhaps, it was only wishful dreaming, but for him it was the prime driving force of his life. There was so much for them to do and their lives were so short in which to do it. For so long as he was leader, they would not waste a day in idle wishing. When the others were gathered to hear what he had to say, he spoke to them. We're going to continue where the old ones had to leave off. We're better adapted than they were, and we're going to find metals to make a ship if there are any to be found. Somewhere on Ragnarok, on the northwest side of a range similar to the Craig Mountains on the plateau, is a deep valley that the Dunbar expedition called the Chasm. They didn't investigate it closely since their instruments showed no metals there, but they saw strata in one place that was red, an iron discoloration. Maybe we can find a vein there that was too small for them to have paid any attention to, so we'll go over the Craigs as soon as the snow melts from them. That will be in early summer, George Ord said, his black eyes thoughtful. Whoever goes will have to time their return for either just before the prowlers and unicorns come back from the north or wait until they've all migrated down off the plateau. It was something Humboldt had been thinking about and wishing they could remedy. Men could elude unicorn attacks wherever there were trees large enough to offer safety, and even prowler attacks could be warded off wherever there were trees for refuge. Spears holding back the prowlers who would climb the trees while arrows picked off the ones on the ground. But there were no trees on the plateau, and to be caught by a band of prowlers or unicorns, there was certain death for any small party of 2 or 3. For that reason, no small parties had ever gone up on the plateau, except when the unicorns and prowlers were gone or nearly so. It was an inconvenience, and it would continue for as long as their weapons were the slow-to-reload bows. You're supposed to be our combination inventor craftsman, he said to George. No one else can compare with you in that respect. Besides, you're not exactly enthusiastic about such hard work as mountain climbing. So from now on you'll do the kind of work you're best fitted for. Your first job is to make us a better bow. Make it like a crossbow with a sliding action to draw and cock the string and with a magazine of arrows mounted on top of it. George studied the idea thoughtfully. The general principle is simple, he said. I'll see what I can do. How many of us will go over the Craig Mountains, Bill? Dan Barber asked. You and I, Humboldt answered. A 3-man party under Bob Craig will go into the Western Hills, and another party under Johnny Stevens will go into the Eastern Hills. He looked toward the adjoining cave where the guns had been stored for so long, coated with unicorn tallow to protect them from rust. We could make gunpowder if we could find a deposit of saltpeter. We already know where there's a little sulfur. The guns would have to be converted to flintlocks, though. Since we don't have what we need for cartridge priming material, Worse, we'd have to use ceramic bullets. They would be inefficient, too light, and destructive to the boars. But we would need powder for mining if we ever found any iron. And if we can't have metal bullets to shoot the germs, we can have bombs to blast them with. Suppose, Johnny Stevens said, that we never do find the metals to make a ship. How will we ever leave Ragnarok if that happens? There's another way, a possible way of leaving here, without a ship of our own. If there are no metals, we'll have to try it. Why wait? Bob Craig demanded. Why not try it now? Because the odds would be about 10,000 to 1 in favor of the germs, but we'll try it if everything else fails. George made, altered, and rejected 4 different types of crossbows before he perfected a reloading bow that met his critical approval. He brought it to where Humboldt stood outside the caves early one spring day when the grass was sending up the first green shoots on the southern hillsides and the long winter was finally dying. Here it is, he said, handing Humboldt the bow. Try it. He took it, noting the fine balance of it. Projecting down from the center of the bow at right angles to it was a stock shaped to fit the grip of the left hand. Under the crossbar was a sliding stock for the right hand. Shaped like the butt of a pistol and fitted with a trigger. Mounted slightly above and to one side of the crossbar was a magazine containing 10 short arrows. The pistol grip was in position near the forestock. He pulled it back the length of the crossbar and it brought the string with it, stretching it taut. There was a click as the trigger mechanism locked the bowstring in place, and at the same time a concealed spring arrangement shoved an arrow into place against the string. He took quick aim at a distant tree and pressed the trigger. There was a twang as the arrow was ejected. He jerked the sliding pistol grip forward and back to reload. Pressing the trigger an instant later, another arrow went its way. By the time he had fired the 10th arrow in the magazine, he was shooting at the rate of 1 arrow per second. On the trunk of the distant tree, like a bristle of stiff whiskers, the 10 arrows were driven deep into the wood in an area no larger than the chest of prowler or head of a unicorn. "This is better than I hoped for," he said to George. 1 man with one of these would equal 6 men with ordinary bows. "I'm going to add another feature," George said. "Bundles of arrows, 10 to the bundle in special holders to carry in the quivers. To reload the magazine, you just slap down a new bundle of arrows, in no more time than it would take to put 1 arrow in an ordinary bow. I figured that with practice, a man should be able to get off 40 arrows in not much more than 20 seconds. George took the bow and went back in the cave to add his new feature. Humboldt stared after him, thinking, if he can make something like that out of wood and unicorn gut, what would he be able to give us if he could have metal? Perhaps George would never have the opportunity to show what he could do with metal. But Humboldt already felt sure that George's genius would, if it ever became necessary, make possible the alternate plan for leaving Ragnarok. The weeks dragged into months, and at last enough snow was gone from the crags that Humboldt and Dan Barber could start. They met no opposition. The prowlers had long since disappeared into the north, and the unicorns were very scarce. They had no occasion to test the effectiveness of the new automatic crossbows in combat, a lack of opportunity that irked Barber. Any other time, if we had ordinary bows, he complained, the unicorns would be popping up to charge us from all directions. "Don't fret," Humboldt consoled him. "This fall, when we come back, they will be." They reached the mountain and stopped near its foot where a creek came down, its water high and muddy with melting snows. There they hunted until they had obtained all the meat they could carry. They would see no more game when they went up the mountain's canyons. A poisonous weed replaced most of the grass in all the canyons, and the animals of Ragnarok had learned long before to shun the mountain. They found the canyon that Craig and his men had tried to explore and started up it. It was there that Craig had discovered the quartz and mica, and so far as he had been able to tell, the head of that canyon would be the lowest of all the passes over the mountain. The canyon went up the mountain diagonally, so that the climb was not steep, although it was constant. They began to see mica and quartz crystals in the creek bed, and at noon on the second day they passed the last stunted tree. Nothing grew higher than that point but the thorny poison weeds, and they were scarce. The air was noticeably thinner there, and their burdens heavier. A short distance beyond they came to a small rock monument, Craig's turn-back point. The next day they found the quartz crystals in place. A mile farther was the vein the mica had come from. Of the other minerals Craig had hoped to find, however, there were only traces. 4th day was an eternity of struggling up the now steeper canyon under loads that seemed to weigh hundreds of pounds, forcing their protesting legs to carry them 50 steps at a time, at the end of which they would stop to rest while their lungs labored to suck in the thin air in quick, panting breaths. It would have been much easier to have gone around the mountain. But the chasm was supposed to be like a huge cavity scooped out of the plateau beyond the mountain, rimmed with sheer cliffs a mile high. Only on the side next to the mountain was there a slope leading down into it. They stopped for the night where the creek ended in a small spring. There the snow still clung to the canyon's walls, and there the canyon curved, offering them the promise of the summit just around the bend as it had been doing all day. The sun was hot and bright the next morning as they made their slow way on again. The canyon straightened, the steep walls of it flattening out to make a pair of ragged shoulders with a saddle between them. They climbed to the summit of the saddle, and there, suddenly before them, was the other side of the world and the chasm. Far below them was a plateau, stretching endlessly like the one they had left behind them, but the chasm dominated all else. It was a gigantic, sheer-walled valley, 100 miles long by 40 miles wide, sunk deep in the plateau with the tops of its mile-high walls level with the floor of the plateau. The mountain under them dropped swiftly away, sloping down and down to the level of the plateau, and then on, down and down again, to the bottom of the chasm that was so deep its floor was half hidden by the morning shadows. "My God," Barbara said, "it must be over 3 miles under us to the bottom, on the vertical. 10 miles of 33% grade. If we go down, we'll never get out again." "You can turn back here if you want to," Humboldt said. "Turn back." Barbara's red whiskers seemed to bristle. "Who in hell said anything about turning back?" "Nobody," Humboldt said, smiling a little at Barbara's quick flash of anger. He studied the chasm, wishing that they could have some way of cutting the quartz crystals and making binoculars. It was a long way to look with the naked eye. Here and there the chasm thrust out arms into the plateau. All the arms were short, however. And even at their heads the cliffs were vertical. The morning shadows prevented a clear view of much of the chasm, and he could see no sign of the red-stained strata that they were searching for. In the southwest corner of the chasm, far away and almost imperceptible, he saw a faint cloud rising up from the chasm's floor. It was impossible to tell what it was, and it faded away as he watched. Barbara saw it too and said, "It looked like smoke." "Do you suppose there could be people or some kind of intelligent things living down there?" "It might have been the vapor from hot springs, condensed by the cool morning air," he said. "Whatever it was, we'll look into it when we get there." The climb down the steep slope into the chasm was swifter than that up the canyon, but no more pleasant. Carrying a heavy pack down such a grade exerted a torturous strain upon the backs of the legs. The heat increased steadily as they descended. They reached the floor of the valley the next day, and the noonday heat was so great that Humboldt wondered if they might not have trapped themselves into what the summer would soon transform into a monstrous oven where no life at all could exist. There could never be any choice. Of course, the mountains were passable only when the weather was hot. The floor of the valley was silt, sand and gravel. They would find nothing there. They set out on a circuit of the chasm's walls, following along close to the base. In many places, the mile-high walls were without a single ledge to break their vertical faces. When they came to the first such place, they saw that the ground near the base was riddled with queer little pits, like tiny craters of the moon. As they looked, there was a crack like a cannon shot, and the ground beside them erupted into an explosion of sand and gravel. When the dust had cleared away, there was a new crater where none had been before. Humboldt wiped the blood from his face where a flying fragment had cut it and said, "The heat of the sun loosens rocks up on the rim. When one falls a mile in a 1.5 gravity, it's traveling like a meteor." They went on through the danger zone. As with the peril of the chasm's heat, there was no choice. Only by observing the material that littered the base of the cliffs could they know what minerals, if any, might be above them. On the 15th day they saw the red-stained stratum. Humboldt quickened his pace, hurrying forward in advance of Barbara. The stratum was too high up on the wall to be reached, but it was not necessary to examine it in place. The base of the cliff was piled thick with fragments from it. He felt the first touch of discouragement as he looked at them. They were a sandstone, light in weight. The iron present was only what the Dunbar expedition had thought it to be, a mere discoloration. They made their way slowly along the foot of the cliff, examining piece after piece in the hope of finding something more than iron stains. There was no variation, however, and a mile farther on they came to the end of the red stratum. Beyond that point the rocks were grey, without a vestige of iron. "So that," Barbara said, looking back the way they had come, "is what we were going to build a ship out of iron stains." Humboldt did not answer. For him it was more than a disappointment. It was the death of a dream he had held since the year he was 9, and had heard that the Dunbar expedition had seen iron-stained rock in a deep chasm, the only iron-stained rock on the face of Ragnarok. Surely, he had thought, there would be enough iron there to build a small ship. For 11 years he had worked toward the day when he would find it. Now he had found it, and it was nothing. The ship was as far away as ever, but discouragement was as useless as iron-stained sandstone. He shook it off and turned to Barbara. "Let's go," he said. "Maybe we'll find something by the time we circle the chasm." For 7 days they risked the danger of death from downward plunging rocks and found nothing. On the 8th day they found the treasure that was not treasure. They stopped for the evening just within the mouth of one of the chasm's tributaries. Humboldt went out to get a drink where a trickle of water ran through the sand, and as he knelt down he saw the flash of something red under him, almost buried in the sand. He lifted it out. It was a stone half the size of his hand, darkly translucent and glowing in the light of the setting sun like blood. It was a ruby. He looked and saw another gleam a little farther up the stream. It was another ruby, almost as large as the first one. Near it was a flawless blue sapphire. Scattered here and there were smaller rubies and sapphires, down to the size of grains of sand. He went farther upstream and saw specimens of still another stone. They were colorless but burning with internal fires. He rubbed one of them hard across the ruby he still carried, and there was a gritting sound as it cut a deep scratch in the ruby. "I'll be damned," he said aloud. There was only one stone hard enough to cut a ruby, the diamond. It was almost dark when he returned to where Barbara was resting beside their packs. "What did you find to keep you out so late?" Barber asked curiously. He dropped a double handful of rubies, sapphires, and diamonds at Barber's feet. Take a look, he said. On a civilized world, what you see there would buy us a ship without our having to lift a finger. Here they're just pretty rocks. Except the diamonds, he added, at least we now have something to cut those quartz crystals with. They took only a few of the rubies and sapphires the next morning, but they gathered more of the diamonds, looking in particular for the grey, black, and ugly, but very hard and tough carbonado variety. Then they resumed their circling of the chasm's walls. The heat continued its steady increase as the days went by. Only at night was there any relief from it, and the nights were growing swiftly shorter as the blue sun rose earlier each morning. When the yellow sun rose, the chasm became a blazing furnace around the edge, of which they crept like ants in some gigantic oven. There was no life in any form to be seen, no animal or bush or blade of grass. There was only the barren floor of the chasm, made a harsh green shade by the two suns and writhing and undulating with heat waves like a nightmare sea, while above them the towering cliffs shimmered, too, and sometimes seemed to be leaning far out over their heads and already falling down upon them. They found no more minerals of any kind, and they came at last to the place where they had seen the smoke or vapor. There the walls of the chasm drew back to form a little valley a mile long by half a mile wide. The walls did not drop vertically to the floor there, but sloped out at the base into a fantastic formation of natural roofs and arches that reached almost to the center of the valley from each side. Green things grew in the shade under the arches, and sparkling waterfalls cascaded down over many of them. A small creek carried the water out of the valley, going out into the chasm a little way before the hot sands absorbed it. They stood and watched for some time, but there was no movement in the valley other than the waving of the green plants as a breeze stirred them. Once the breeze shifted to bring them the fresh, sweet scent of growing things and urged them to come closer. A place like that doesn't belong here, Barber said in a low voice. But it's there. I wonder what else is there. Shade and cool water, Humboldt said, and maybe things that don't like strangers. Let's go find out. They watched warily as they walked, their crossbows in their hands. At the closer range they saw that the roofs and arches were the outer remains of a system of natural caves that went back into the valley's walls. The green vegetation grew wherever the roofs gave part-time shade, consisting mainly of a holly-leafed bush with purple flowers and a tall plant resembling corn. Under some of the roofs the corn was mature, the orange-colored grains visible. Under others it was no more than half-grown. He saw the reason and said to Barber, "There are both warm and cold springs here. The plants watered by the warm springs would grow almost the year around, the ones watered by the cold springs only in the summer, and what we saw from the mountain top would have been vapor rising from the warm springs." They passed under arch after arch without seeing any life. When they came to the valley's upper end, and still had seen nothing, it seemed evident that there was little danger of an encounter with any intelligent and hostile creatures. Apparently nothing at all lived in the little valley. Humboldt stopped under a broad arch where the breeze was made cool and moist by the spray of water it had come through. Barber went on to look under the adjoining arch. Caves led into the wall from both arches, and as he stood there Humboldt saw something lying in the mouth of the nearest cave. It was a little mound of orange corn, lying in a neat pile, as though whatever had left it there had intended to come back after it. He looked toward the other arch, but Barber was somewhere out of sight. He doubted that whatever had left the corn could be much of a menace. Dangerous animals were more apt to eat flesh than corn, but he went to the cave with his crossbow ready. He stopped at the mouth of the cave to let his eyes become accustomed to the darkness inside it. As he did so, the things inside came out to meet him. They emerged into full view, 6 little animals the size of squirrels, each of them a different color. They walked on short hind legs like miniature bears, and the dark eyes in the bear chipmunk faces were fixed on him with intense interest. They stopped 5 feet in front of him, there to stand in a neat row and continue the fascinated staring up at him. The yellow one in the center scratched absently at its stomach with a furry paw, and he lowered the bow, feeling a little foolish at having bothered to raise it against animals so small and harmless. Then he half brought it up again as the yellow one opened its mouth, and said in a tone that held distinct anticipation, "I think we'll eat you for supper." He darted glances to right and left, but there was nothing near him except the 6 little animals. The yellow one, having spoken, was staring silently at him with only curiosity on its furry face. He wondered if some miasma or some scent from the vegetation in the valley had warped his mind into sudden insanity and asked, "You think you'll do what?" It opened its mouth again to stutter. Aye, then, with a note of alarm, "Hey." It said no more, and the next sound was that of Barber hurrying toward him and calling, "Hey Bill, where are you?" "Here," he answered, and he was already sure that he knew why the little animal had spoken to him. Barber came up and saw the 6 chipmunk bears. "6 of them," he exclaimed. "There's one in the next cave. The damned thing spoke to me." "I thought so," he replied. "You told it we'd have it for supper, and then it said you think you'll do what, didn't it?" Barber's face showed surprise. "How did you know that?" "They are telepathic between one another," he said. "The yellow one there repeated what the one you spoke to heard you say, and it repeated what the yellow one heard me say. It has to be telepathy between them." Telepathy, Barbara stared at the 6 little animals, who stared back with their fascinated curiosity undiminished. But why should they want to repeat aloud what they received telepathically? I don't know. Maybe at some stage in their evolution only part of them were telepaths, and the telepaths broadcasted danger warnings to the others that way. So far as that goes, why does a parrot repeat what it hears? There was a scurry of movement behind Barbara, and another of the little animals, a white one, hurried past them. It went to the yellow one and they stood close together as they stared up. Apparently they were mates. That's the other one, those are the 2 that mocked us, Barbara said. And thereby gave them the name by which they would be known, mockers. The mockers were fresh meat, but they accepted the humans with such friendliness and trust that Barbara lost all his desire to have one for supper or for any other time. They had a limited supply of dried meat and there would be plenty of orange corn. They would not go hungry. They discovered that the mockers had living quarters in both the cool caves and the ones warmed by the hot springs. There was evidence that they hibernated during the winters in the warm caves. There were no minerals in the mockers' valley, and they set out to continue their circuit of the chasm. They did not get far until the heat had become so great that the chasm's tributaries began going dry. They turned back then, to wait in the little valley until the full rains came. When the long summer was ended by the first rain, they resumed their journey. They took a supply of the orange corn and 2 of the mockers. Yellow one and its mate. The other mockers watched them leave, standing silent and solemn in front of their caves, as though they feared they might never see their 2 fellows or the humans again. The 2 mockers were pleasant company, riding on their shoulders and chattering any nonsense that came to mind, and sometimes saying things that were not at all nonsense, making Humboldt wonder if mockers could partly read human minds and dimly understand the meaning of some of the things they said. They found a place where saltpeter was very thinly and erratically distributed. They scraped off all the films of it that were visible and procured a small amount. They completed their circuit and reached the foot of the long, steep slope of the crags without finding anything more. It was an awesome climb that lay before them, up a grade so steep and barred with so many low ledges that when their legs refused to carry them farther they crawled. The heat was still very serious, and there would be no water until they came to the spring beyond the mountain's summit. A burning wind, born on the blazing floor of the chasm, followed them up the mountain all day. Their leather canteens were almost dry when night came, and they were no more than a third of the way to the top. The mockers had become silent as the elevation increased, and when they stopped for the night, Humboldt saw that they would never live to cross the mountain. They were breathing fast, their hearts racing, as they tried to extract enough oxygen from the thin air. They drank a few drops of water, but they would not touch the corn he offered them. The white mocker died at mid-morning the next day as they stopped for a rest. The yellow one crawled feebly to her side and died a few minutes later. So that's that, Humboldt said, looking down at them. The only things on Ragnarok that ever trusted us and wanted to be our friends, and we killed them. They drank the last of their water and went on. They made dry camp that night, and dreams of cold streams of water tormented their exhausted sleep. The next day was a hellish eternity in which they walked and fell and crawled and walked and fell again. Barbara weakened steadily, his breathing growing to a rattling panting. He spoke once that afternoon, to try to smile with dry, swollen lips and say between his panting gasps, "It would be hell to have to die so thirsty like this." After that he fell with increasing frequency, each time slower and weaker in getting up again. Half a mile short of the summit he fell for the last time. He tried to get up, failed, and tried to crawl. He failed at that too and collapsed face down in the rocky soil. Humboldt went to him and said between his own labored intakes of breath, "Wait, Dan, I'll go and bring you back water." Barbara raised himself with a great effort and looked up. "No use," he said. "My heart too much." He fell forward again, and that time he was very still, his desperate panting no more. It seemed to Humboldt that it was half a lifetime later that he finally reached the spring and the cold, clear water. He drank, the most ecstatic pleasure he had ever experienced in his life. Then the pleasure drained away as he seemed to see Dan Barber trying to smile and seemed to hear him say, "It would be hell to have to die so thirsty like this." He rested for 2 days before he was in condition to continue on his way. He reached the plateau and saw that the woods goats had been migrating south for some time. On the second morning he climbed up a gentle roll in the plain and met 3 unicorns face to face. They charged at once, squealing with anticipation. Had he been equipped with an ordinary bow, he would have been killed within seconds. But the automatic crossbow poured a rain of arrows into the faces of the unicorns that caused them to swing aside in pain and enraged astonishment. The moment they had swung enough to expose the area just behind their heads, the arrows became fatal. 1 unicorn escaped, 3 arrows bristling in its face. It watched him from a distance for a little while, squealing and shaking its head in baffled fury. Then it turned and disappeared over a swell in the plain, running like a deer. He resumed his southward march, hurrying faster than before. The unicorn had headed north, and that could be for but one purpose, to bring enough reinforcements to finish the job. He reached the caves at night. No one was up but George Ord, working late in his combination workshop laboratory. George looked up at the sound of his entrance and saw that he was alone. "So Dan didn't make it?" he asked. "The chasm got him," he answered. and then wearily, the chasm, we found the damn thing. The red stratum, it was only iron stains. I made a little pilot smelter while you were gone, George said. I was hoping the red stratum would be ore. The other prospecting parties, none of them found anything. We'll try again next spring, he said. We'll find it somewhere, no matter how long it takes. Our time may not be so long. The observations show the sun to be farther south than ever. Then we'll make double use of the time we do have. We'll cut the hunting parties to the limit and send out more prospecting parties. We're going to have a ship to meet the Journes again. Sometimes, George said, his black eyes studying him thoughtfully, I think that's all you live for, Bill, for the day when you can kill Journes. George said it as a statement of a fact without censure, but Humboldt could not keep an edge of harshness out of his voice as he answered, For as long as I'm leader, that's all we're all going to live for. He followed the game south that fall, taking with him Bob Craig and young Anders. Hundreds of miles south of the caves they came to the lowlands, a land of much water and vegetation and vast herds of unicorns and woods goats. It was an exceedingly dangerous country, due to the concentration of unicorns and prowlers, and only the automatic crossbows combined with never-ceasing vigilance enabled them to survive. There they saw the crawlers, hideous things that crawled on multiple legs like 3-ton centipedes. Their mouths set with 6 mandibles and dripping a stinking saliva. The bite of a crawler was poisonous, instantly paralyzing even to a unicorn, though not instantly killing them. The crawlers ate their victims at once, however, ripping the helpless and still living flesh from its bones. Although the unicorns feared the crawlers, the prowlers hated them with a fanatical intensity and made use of their superior quickness to kill every crawler they found, ripping at the crawler until the crawler, in an insanity of rage, bit itself and died of its own poison. They had taken one of the powerful longbows with them in addition to their crossbows, and they killed a crawler with it one day. As they did so, a band of 20 prowlers came suddenly upon them. 20 prowlers, with the advantage of surprise at short range, could have slaughtered them. Instead, the prowlers continued on their way without as much as a challenging snarl. Now why, Bob Craig wondered, did they do that? They saw we had just killed a crawler, Humboldt said. The crawlers are their enemies, and I guess letting us live was their way of showing appreciation. Their further explorations of the lowlands revealed no minerals, nothing but alluvial material of unknown depth, and there was no reason to stay longer except that return to the caves was impossible until spring came. They built attack-proof shelters in the trees and settled down to wait out the winter. They started north with the first wave of woods goats. Nothing but lack of success to show for their months of time and effort. When they were almost to the caves, they came to the barren valley where the Journes had herded the rejects out of the cruisers, and to the place where the stockade had been. It was a lonely place, the stockade walls fallen and scattered, and the graves of Humboldt's mother and all the others long since obliterated by the hooves of the unicorn legions. Bitter memories were reawakened, tinged by the years with nostalgia, and the stockade was far behind them before the dark mood left him. The orange corn was planted that spring, and the number of prospecting parties was doubled. The corn sprouted, grew feebly, and died before maturity. The prospecting parties returned one by one, each to report no success. He decided that fall. That time was too precious to waste. They would have to use the alternate plan he had spoken of. He went to George Ord and asked him if it would be possible to build a hyperspace transmitter with the materials they had. It's the one way we could have a chance to leave here without a ship of our own, he said, by luring a Journe cruiser here and then taking it away from them. George shook his head. A hyperspace transmitter might be built, given enough years of time. But it would be useless without power. It would take a generator of such size that we'd have to melt down every gun, knife, axe, every piece of steel and iron we have, and then we'd be 500 pounds short. On top of that, we'd have to have at least 300 pounds more of copper for additional wire. I didn't realize it would take such a large generator, he said after a silence. I was sure we could have a transmitter. Get me the metal and we can, George said. He sighed restlessly, and there was almost hatred in his eyes as he looked at the enclosing walls of the cave. You're not the only one who would like to leave our prison. Get me 800 pounds of copper and iron and I'll make the transmitter some way. 800 pounds of metal. On Ragnarok, that was like asking for the sun. The years went by, and each year there was the same determined effort, the same lack of success. And each year the suns were farther south, marking the coming of the end of any efforts other than the one to survive. In the year 30, when fall came earlier than ever before, he was forced to admit to himself the bleak and bitter fact. He and the others were not of the generation that would escape from Ragnarok. They were earthborn, they were not adapted to Ragnarok, and could not scour a world of 1.5 gravity for metals that might not exist. And vengeance was a luxury he could not have. A question grew in his mind where there had been only his hatred for the Journes before. What would become of the future generations on Ragnarok? With the question, a scene from his childhood kept coming back to him. A late summer evening in the first year on Ragnarok, and Julia sitting beside him in the warm starlight. You're my son, Billy, she had said. The first I ever had. Now, before so very long, maybe I'll have another one. Hesitantly, not wanting to believe, he had asked, what some of them said about how you might die, then it won't really happen. Will it, Julia? It might. Then her arm had gone around him and she had said, "If I do, I'll leave in my place a life that's more important than mine ever was. Remember me, Billy, and this evening, and what I said to you if you should ever be leader. Remember that it's only through the children that we can ever survive and whip this world. Protect them while they are small and helpless, and teach them to fight and be afraid of nothing when they're a little older. Never let them forget how they came to be on Ragnarok. Someday, even if it's 100 years from now, the Gerns will come again and they must be ready to fight, for their freedom and for their lives." He had been too young then to understand how truly she had spoken, and when he was old enough his hatred for the Gerns had blinded him to everything but his own desires. Now he could see. The children of each generation would be better adapted to Ragnarok, and full adaptation would eventually come. But all the generations of the future would be potential slaves of the Gern Empire, free only so long as they remained unnoticed. It was inconceivable that the Gerns should never pass by Ragnarok through all time to come. And when they finally came, the slow, uneventful progression of decades and centuries might have brought a false sense of security to the people of Ragnarok. Might have turned the stories of what the Gerns did to the rejects into legends, and then into myths that no one any longer believed. The Gerns would have to be brought to Ragnarok before that could happen. He went to George Ord again and said, "There's one kind of transmitter we could make a generator for a plain normal space transmitter, without a receiver." George laid down the diamond cutting wheel he had been working on. "It would take 200 years for the signal to get to Athena at the speed of light," he said. Then 40 days after it got there, a Gern cruiser would come hell-bent to investigate. "I want the ones of the future to know that the Gerns will be here no later than 200 years from now, and with always the chance that a Gern cruiser in space might pick up the signal at any time before then." "I see," George said, the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads to make them remember. "You know what would happen to them if they ever forgot. You're as old as I am, you know what the Gerns did to us." "I'm older than you are," George said. "I was 9 when the Gerns left us here. They kept my father and mother, and my sister was only 3. I tried to keep her warm by holding her, but the hell fever got her that first night. She was too young to understand why I couldn't help her more." Hatred burned in his eyes at the memory, like some fire that had been banked but had never died. "Yes, I remember the Gerns and what they did. I wouldn't want it to have to happen to others. The transmitter will be made so that it won't." The guns were melted down, together with other items of iron and steel, to make the castings for the generator. Ceramic pipes were made to carry water from the spring to a water wheel. The long, slow job of converting the miscellany of electronic devices, many of them broken, into the components of a transmitter proceeded. It was 5 years before the transmitter was ready for testing. It was early fall of the year 35 then, and the water that gushed from the pipe splashed in cold drops against Humboldt as the water wheel was set in motion. The generator began to hum and George observed the output of it and the transmitter as registered by the various meters he had made. "Weak, but it will reach the Gern monitor station on Athena," he said. "It's ready to send. What do you want to say?" "Make it something short," he said. "Make it Ragnarok calling." George poised his finger over the transmitting key. "This will set forces in motion that can never be recalled. What we do here this morning is going to cause a lot of Gerns or Ragnarok people to die. It will be the Gerns who die," he said. "Send the signal." "Like you, I believe the same thing," George said. "I have to believe it because that's the way I want it to be. I hope we're right. It's something we'll never know." He began depressing the key. A boy was given the job of operating the key, and the signal went out daily until the freezing of winter stopped the water wheel that powered the generator. The sending of the signals was resumed when spring came, and the prospecting parties continued their vain search for metals. The suns continued moving south, and each year the springs came later, the falls earlier. In the spring of 45, he saw that he would have to make his final decision. By then they had dwindled until they numbered only 68, the young ones gray and rapidly growing old. There was no longer any use to continue the prospecting. If any metals were to be found, they were at the north end of the plateau, where the snow no longer melted during the summer. They were too few to do more than prepare for what the old ones had feared they might have to face: big winter. That would require the work of all of them. Sheets of mica were brought down from the craigs, the summits of which were deeply buried under snow even in midsummer. Stoves were made of fire clay and mica, which would give both heat and light and would be more efficient than the open fireplaces. The innermost caves were prepared for occupation, with multiple doors to hold out the cold, and with laboriously excavated ventilation ducts and smoke outlets. There were 60 of them in the fall of 50, when all had been done that could be done to prepare for what might come. "There aren't many of the Earthborn left now," Bob Craig said to him one night as they sat in the flickering light of a stove. "And there hasn't been time for there to be many of the Ragnarok-born. The Gerns wouldn't get many slaves if they should come now. They could use however many they found," he answered. "The younger ones, who are the best adapted to this gravity, would be exceptionally strong and quick on a one-gravity world. There are dangerous jobs where a strong, quick slave is a lot more efficient and expendable than complex, expensive machines. And they would want some specimens for scientific study," Jim Lake said. They would want to cut into the young ones and see how they are built, that they're adapted to this 1.5 gravity world. He smiled with the cold mirthlessness that always reminded Humboldt of his father of the lake, who had been the Constellation S lieutenant commander. According to the books, the Gerns never did try to make it a secret that when a Gern doctor or biologist cuts into the muscles or organs of a non-Gern to see what makes them tick, he wants them to be still alive and ticking as he does so. 17-year-old Don Chiara spoke, to say slowly, thoughtfully, slavery and vivisection. If the Gerns should come now when there are so few of us, and if we should fight the best we could and lose, it would be better for whoever was the last of us left to put a knife in the hearts of the women and children than to let the Gerns have them. No one made any answer. There was no answer to make, no alternative to suggest. In the future there will be more of us and it will be different, he said at last. On Earth the Gerns were always stronger and faster than humans, but when the Gerns come to Ragnarok, they're going to find a race that isn't really human anymore. They're going to find a race before which they'll be like woods goats before prowlers. If only they don't come too soon, Craig said. That was the chance that had to be taken, he replied. He wondered again as he spoke, as he had wondered so often in the past years, if he had given them all their death sentence when he ordered the transmitter built. Yet the future generations could not be permitted to forget, and steel could not be tempered without first thrusting it into the fire. He was the last of the young ones when he awoke one night in the fall of 56 and found himself burning with the hell fever. He did not summon any of the others. They could do nothing for him, and he had already done all he could for them. He had done all he could for them. And now he would leave 49 men, women and children to face the unknown forces of Big Winter, while over them hung the sword he had forged, the increasing danger of detection by the Gerns. The question came again, sharp with the knowledge that it was far too late for him to change any of it. Did I arrange the execution of my people? Then, through the red haze of the fever, Julia spoke to him out of the past, sitting again beside him in the summer twilight and saying, "Remember me, Billy, in this evening and what I said to you. Teach them to fight and be afraid of nothing. Never let them forget how they came to be on Ragnarok." She seemed very near and real, and the doubt faded and was gone. Teach them to fight. Never let them forget. The men of Ragnarok were only fur-clad hunters who crouched in caves, but they would grow in numbers as time went by. Each generation would be stronger than the generation before it, and he had set forces in motion that would bring the last generation the trial of combat and the opportunity for freedom. How well they fought on that day would determine their destiny, but he was certain, once again, what that destiny would be. It would be to walk as conquerors before beaten and humbled Gerns. It was winter of the year 85, and the temperature was 106 degrees below zero. Walter Humboldt stood in front of the ice tunnel that led back through the glacier to the caves and looked up into the sky. It was noon, but there was no sun in the starlit sky. Many weeks before the sun had slipped below the southern horizon. For a little while a dim halo had marked its passage each day, then that too had faded away. But now it was time for the halo to appear again, to herald the sun's returning. Frost filled the sky, making the stars flicker as it swirled endlessly downward. He blinked against it, his eyelashes trying to freeze to his lower eyelids at the movement, and turned to look at the north. There the northern lights were a gigantic curtain that filled a third of the sky, rippling and waving in folds that pulsated in red and green, rose and lavender and violet. Their reflection gleamed on the glacier that sloped down from the caves and glowed softly on the other glacier, the one that covered the transmitter station. The transmitter had long ago been taken into the caves, but the generator and water wheel were still there, frozen in a tomb of ice. For 3 years the glacier had been growing before the caves, and the plateau's southern face had been buried under snow for 10 years. Only a few woods goats ever came as far north as the country south of the caves, and they stayed only during the brief period between the last snow of spring and the first snow of fall. Their winter home was somewhere down near the equator. What had been called the southern lowlands was a frozen, lifeless waste. Once they had thought about going to the valley in the chasm, where the markers would be hibernating in their warm caves. But even if they could have gone up the plateau and performed the incredible feat of crossing the glacier-covered, blizzard-dripped crags, they would have found no food in the markers' valley, only a little corn the markers had stored away, which would soon have been exhausted. There was no place for them to live but in the caves, or as nomads migrating with the animals. And if they migrated to the equator, each year they would have to leave behind them all the books and tools, and everything that might someday have given them a civilized way of life, and might someday have shown them how to escape from their prison. He looked again to the south where the halo should be, thinking, they should have made their decision in there by now. I'm their leader, but I can't force them to stay here against their will. I could only ask them to consider what it would mean if we left here. Snow creaked underfoot as he moved restlessly. He saw something lying under the blanket of frost and went to it. It was an arrow that someone had dropped. He picked it up carefully because the intense cold had made the shaft as brittle as glass. It would regain its normal strength when taken into the caves. There was the sound of steps, and Fred Schroeder came out of the tunnel, dressed as he was dressed in bulky furs. Schroeder looked to the south and said, "It seems to be starting to get a little lighter there." he saw that it was a small, faint paling of the black sky. They talked over what you and I told them, Schroeder said, and about how we've struggled to stay here this long and how, even if the sun should stop drifting south this year, it will be years of ice and cold at the caves before big spring comes. If we leave here, the glacier will cover the caves and fill them with ice, he said. All we ever had will be buried back in there, and all we'll have left will be our bows and arrows and animal skins. You'll be taking a one-way road back into the Stone Age for ourselves and our children and their children. They know that, Schroeder said. We both told them. He paused. They watched the sky to the south turn lighter. The northern lights flamed unnoticed behind them as the pale halo of the invisible sun slowly brightened to its maximum. Their faces were white with near freezing then, and they turned to go back into the caves. They had made their decision, Schroeder went on. I guess you and I did them an injustice when we thought they had lost their determination, when we thought they might want to hand their children a flint axe and say, "Here, take this, and let it be the symbol of all you are or all you will ever be." Their decision was unanimous. We'll stay for as long as it's possible for us to survive here. Howard Lake listened to teacher Morgan West read from the diary of Walter Humboldt, written during the terrible winter of 35 years before. Each morning the light to the south was brighter. On the 7th morning we saw the sun, and it was not due until the 8th morning. It will be years before we can stop fighting the enclosure of the glacier, but we have reached and passed the dead of big winter. We have reached the bottom, and the only direction we can go in the future is up. So, West said, closing the book, we are here in the caves tonight because of the stubbornness of Humboldt and Schroeder and all the others. Had they thought only of their own welfare, had they conceded defeat and gone into the migratory way of life, we would be sitting beside grass campfires somewhere to the south tonight, our way of life containing no plans or aspirations greater than to follow the game back and forth through the years. Now, let's go outside to finish tonight's lesson. Teacher West led the way into the starlit night just outside the caves, Howard Lake and the other children following him. West pointed to the sky where the star group they called the Athena constellation blazed like a huge arrowhead high in the east. There, he said, beyond the top of the arrowhead, is where we were going when the Gerns stopped us 120 years ago and left us to die on Ragnarok. It's so far that Athena's sun can't be seen from here. So far that it will be another 115 years before our first signal gets there. Why is it then that you and all the other groups of children have to learn such things as history, physics, the Gern language, and the way to fire a Gern blaster? The hand of every child went up. West selected 8-year-old Clifton Humboldt. Tell us, Clifton, he said. Because, Clifton answered. A Gern cruiser might pass by a few light years out at any time and pick up our signals. So we have to know all we can about them and how to fight them because there aren't very many of us yet. The Gerns will come to kill us, little Marie Chiara said, her dark eyes large and earnest. They'll come to kill us and to make slaves out of the ones they don't kill, like they did with the others a long time ago. They're awful mean and awful smart, and we have to be smarter than they are. Howard looked again at the Athena constellation, thinking, I hope they come just as soon as I'm old enough to fight them, or even tonight. Teacher, he asked, how would a Gern cruiser look if it came tonight? Would it come from the Athena arrowhead? It probably would, West answered. You would see its rocket blast like a bright trail of fire. A bright trail of fire burst suddenly into being, coming from the constellation of Athena and lighting up the woods and hills and their startled faces as it arced down toward them. It's them, a treble voice exclaimed, and there was a quick flurry of movement as Howard and the other older children shoved the younger children behind them. Then the light vanished, leaving a dimming glow where it had been. Only a meteor, West said. He looked at the line of older children who were standing protectingly in front of the younger ones, rocks in their hands with which to ward off the Gerns, and he smiled in the way he had when he was pleased with them. Howard watched the meteor trail fade swiftly into invisibility and felt his heartbeat slow from the first wild thrill to grey disappointment. Only a meteor, but someday he might be leader, and by then surely the Gerns would come. If not, he would find some way to make them come. 10 years later, Howard Lake was leader. There were 350 of them then, and Big Spring was on its way to becoming Big Summer. The snow was gone from the southern end of the plateau, and once again game migrated up the valleys east of the caves. There were many things to be done now that Big Winter was past, and they could have the chance to do them. They needed a larger pottery kiln, a larger workshop with a wooden lathe, more diamonds to make cutting wheels, more quartz crystals to make binoculars and microscopes. They could again explore the field of inorganic chemistry. Even though results in the past had produced nothing of value, and they could, within a few years, resume the metal prospecting up the plateau, the most important project of all. Their weapons seemed to be as perfect as was possible, but when the Gerns came they would need some quick and certain means of communication between the various units that would fight the Gerns. A leader who could not communicate with his forces and coordinate their actions would be helpless. And they had on Ragnarok a form of communication, if trained, that the Gerns could not detect or interfere with electronically. The markers. The crags were still white and impassable with snow that summer, but the snow was receding higher each year. 5 years later, in the summer of 135, the crags were passable for a few weeks. Lake led a party of 8 over them and down into the chasm. They took with them 2 small cages, constructed of wood and glass and made airtight with the strong medusabush glue. Each cage was equipped with a simple air pump and a pressure gauge. They brought back 2 pairs of markers as interested and trusting captives, together with a supply of the orange corn and a large amount of diamonds. The markers, in their pressure-maintained cages, were not even aware of the increase in elevation as they were carried over the high summit of the crags. To Lake and the men with him, the climb back up the long, steep slope of the mountain was a stiff climb to make in one day, but no more than that. It was hard to believe that it had taken Humboldt and Barber almost 3 days to climb it, and that Barber had died in the attempt. It reminded him of the old crossbows that Humboldt and the others had used. They were thin, with a light pull, such as the present generation boys used. It must have required courage for the old ones to dare unicorn attacks with bows so thin that only the small area behind the unicorn's jaws was vulnerable to their arrows. When the caves were reached, a very gradual reduction of pressure in the marker cages was started, one that would cover a period of weeks. 1 pair of markers survived and had 2 young ones that fall. The young markers, like the first generation of Ragnarok-born children of many years before, were more adapted to their environment than their parents were. The orange corn was planted, using an adaptation method somewhat similar to that used with the markers. It might have worked had the orange corn not required such a long period of time in which to reach maturity. When winter came, only a few grains had formed. They were saved for next year's seeds to continue the slow adaptation process. By the 5th year, the youngest generation of markers was well adapted to the elevation of the caves, but for a susceptibility to a quickly fatal form of pneumonia, which made it necessary to keep them from exposing themselves to the cold or to any sudden changes of temperature. Their intelligence was surprising, and they seemed to be partially receptive to human thoughts, as Bill Humboldt had written. By the end of the 15th year, their training had reached such a stage of perfection that a marker would transmit, or not transmit, with only the unspoken thought of its master to tell it which it should be. In addition, they would transmit the message to whichever marker their master's thought directed. Presumably all markers received the message, but only the marker to whom it was addressed would repeat it aloud. They had their method of communication. They had their automatic crossbows for quick, close fighting, and their long-range longbows. They were fully adapted to the 1.5 gravity, and their reflexes were almost like those of prowlers. Ragnarok had long ago separated the quick from the dead. There were 819 of them that year, in the early spring of 150, and they were ready and impatient for the coming of the Journes. Then the transmitter, which had been in operation again for many years, failed one day. George Craig had finished checking it when Lake arrived. He looked up from his instruments, remarkably similar in appearance to a sketch of the old George Ord, a resemblance that had been passed down to him by his mother, and said, "The entire circuit is either gone or ready to go. It's already operated for a lot longer than it should have." "It doesn't matter," Lake said. "It served its purpose. We won't rebuild it." George watched him questioningly. "It served its purpose," he said again. "It didn't let us forget that the Journes will come again. But that isn't enough now. The first signal won't reach Athena until the year 235. It will be the dead of big winter again then. They'll have to fight the Journes with bows and arrows that the cold will make as brittle as glass. They won't have a chance." "No," George said, "they won't have a chance, but what can we do to change it?" "It's something I've been thinking about," he said. "We'll build a hyperspace transmitter and bring the Journes before big winter comes." "We will?" George asked, lifting his dark eyebrows. "And what do we use for the 300 pounds of copper and 500 pounds of iron we would have to make the generator?" "Surely we can find 500 pounds of iron somewhere on Ragnarok. The north end of the plateau might be the best bet. As for the copper, I doubt that we'll ever find it. But there are seams of bauxite-like clay in the western hills. They are certain to contain aluminum to at least some extent. So we'll make the wires of aluminum. The ore would have to be refined to pure aluminum oxide before it could be smelted," George said. "And you can't smelt aluminum ore in an ordinary furnace, only in an electric furnace with a generator that can supply a high amperage. And we would have to have cryolite ore to serve as the solvent in the smelting process. There's a seam of cryolite in the eastern hills, according to the old maps," said Lake. "We could make a larger generator by melting down everything we have. It wouldn't be big enough to power the hyperspace transmitter, but it should be big enough to smelt aluminum ore." George considered the idea. "I think we can do it." "How long until we can send the signal?" he asked. "Given the extra metal we need, the building of the generator is a simple job. The transmitter is what will take years, maybe as long as 50 years. Can't anything be done to make it sooner?" he asked. "I know," George said. "You would like for the Journes to come while you're still here. So would every man on Ragnarok. But even on Earth, the building of a hyperspace transmitter was a long, slow job, with all the materials they needed and all the special tools and equipment. Here we'll have to do everything by hand, and for materials we have only broken and burned out odds and ends. It will take about 50 years, it can't be helped. 50 years. But that would bring the Journes before big winter came again. and there was the rapidly increasing chance that a Jern cruiser would at any day intercept the first signals. They were already more than halfway to Athena. "Melt down the generator," he said. "Start making a bigger one. Tomorrow men will go out after bauxite and cryolite, and 4 of us will go up the plateau to look for iron." Lake selected Gene Taylor, Tony Chiara, and Steve Schroeder to go with him. They were well on their way by daylight the next morning. On the shoulder of each of them, a marker which observed the activity in new scenes with bright, interested eyes. They traveled light, since they would have fresh meat all the way, and carried herbs and corn only for the markers. Once, generations before, it had been necessary for men to eat herbs to prevent deficiency diseases, but now the deficiency diseases, like hell fever, were unknown to them. They carried no compasses, since the radiations of the 2 suns constantly created magnetic storms that caused compass needles to swing as much as 20 degrees within an hour. Each of them carried a pair of powerful binoculars, however, binoculars that had been diamond carved from the ivory-like black unicorn horn and set with lenses and prisms of diamond-cut quartz. The foremost bands of woods goats followed the advance of spring up the plateau, and they followed the woods goats. They could not go ahead of the goats were already pressing close behind the melting of the snow. No hills or ridges were seen as the weeks went by, and it seemed to Lake that they would walk forever across the endless rolling floor of the plain. Early summer came, and they walked across a land that was green and pleasantly cool at a time when the vegetation around the caves would be burned brown and lifeless. The woods goats grew less in number then, as some of them stopped for the rest of the summer in their chosen latitudes. They continued on, and at last they saw, far to the north, what seemed to be an almost infinitesimal bulge on the horizon. They reached it 2 days later, a land of rolling green hills, scarred here and there with ragged outcroppings of rock, and a land that climbed slowly and steadily higher as it went into the north. They camped that night in a little vale. The floor of it was white with the bones of woods goats that had tarried too long the fall before and got caught by an early blizzard. There was still flesh on the bones, and scavenger rodents scuttled among the carcasses, feasting. "We'll split up now," he told the others the next morning. He assigned each of them his position. Steve Schroeder to parallel his course 30 miles to his right, Gene Taylor to go 30 miles to his left, and Tony Chiara to go 30 miles to the left of Taylor. "We'll try to hold those distances," he said. "We can't look over the country in detail that way, but it will give us a good general survey of it. We don't have too much time left by now, and we'll make as many miles into the north as we can each day. The woods goats will tell us when it's time for us to turn back." They parted company with casual farewells, but for Steve Schroeder, who smiled sardonically at the bones of the woods goats in the vale and asked, "Who's supposed to tell the woods goats?" Tip, the black, white-nosed marker on Lake's shoulder, kept twisting his neck to watch the departure of the others until he had crossed the next hill and the others were hidden from view. "All right, Tip," he said then. "You can unwind your neck now." "Unwind, all right," Tip said. Then with a sudden burst of energy which was characteristic of markers, he began to jiggle up and down and chant in time with his movements. All right. "Shut up," he commanded. "If you want to talk nonsense, I don't care, but don't say all right anymore." "All right," Tip agreed amiably, settling down. "Shut up if you want to talk nonsense, I don't care. And don't slaughter the punctuation like that. Change the meaning entirely. But don't say all right anymore," Tip went on, ignoring him. "You changed the meaning entirely." Then, with another surge of animation, Tip began to fish in his jacket pocket with little hand-like paws. Tip hungry. Lake unbuttoned the pocket and gave Tip a herb leaf. "I notice there's no nonsensical chatter when you want to ask for something to eat." Tip took the herb leaf, but he spoke again before he began to eat. Slowly, as though trying seriously to express a thought. "Tip hungry, no nonsensical." "Sometimes," he said, turning his head to look at Tip, "you markers give me the peculiar feeling that you're right on the edge of becoming a new and intelligent race, and no fooling." Tip wiggled his whiskers and bit into the herb leaf. "No fooling," he agreed. He stopped for the night in a steep-walled hollow and built a small fire of dead moss and grass to ward off the chill that came with dark. He called the others, thinking first of Schroeder so that Tip would transmit to Schroeder's marker. "Steve, here," Tip answered in a detectable imitation of Schroeder's voice. No luck. He thought of Gene Taylor and called Gene. There was no answer, and he called Chiara. "Tony, could you see any of Gene's route today?" "Part of it," Chiara answered. "I saw a herd of unicorns over that way. Why doesn't he answer?" "No." Then, Chiara said, "They must have got him." "Did you find anything today, Tony?" he asked. "Nothing but pure andesite, not even an iron stain." It was the same kind of barren formation that he himself had been walking over all day, but he had not expected success so soon. He tried once again to call Gene Taylor. Gene, are you there, Gene?" There was no answer. He knew there would never be. The days became weeks with dismaying swiftness as they penetrated farther into the north. The hills became more rugged, and there were intrusions of granite and other formations to promise a chance of finding metal. A promise that urged them on faster as their time grew shorter. Twice he saw something white in the distance. Once it was the bones of another band of woods goats that had huddled together and frozen to death in some early blizzard of the past, and once it was the bones of a dozen unicorns. The nights grew chillier, and the suns moved faster and faster to the south. The animals began to migrate, an almost imperceptible movement in the beginning, but one that increased each day. The first frost came and the migration began in earnest. By the third day it was a hurrying tide. Tip was strangely silent that day. He did not speak until the noon sun had cleared the cold, heavy mists of morning. When he spoke, it was to give a message from Chiara. Howard, last report. Goldie is dying, pneumonia. Goldie was Chiara's marker, his only means of communication, and there would be no way to tell him when they were turning back. Turn back today, Tony. He said, Steve and I will go on for a few days more. There was no answer, and he said quickly, turn back, acknowledge that, Tony. Turning back, the acknowledgement came, tried to save her. The message stopped, and there was a silence that Chiara's marker would never break again. He walked on, with Tip sitting very small and quiet on his shoulder. He had crossed another hill before Tip moved. To press up close to him the way markers did when they were lonely, and to hold tightly to him. What is it, Tip? He asked. Goldie is dying, Tip said, and then again like a soft, sad whisper, Goldie is dying. She was your mate, I'm sorry. Tip made a little whimpering sound, and the man reached up to stroke his silky side. I'm sorry, he said again. I'm sorry as hell, little fellow. For 2 days Tip sat lonely and silent on his shoulder, no longer interested in the new scenes, nor any longer relieving the monotony with his chatter. He refused to eat until the morning of the third day. By then the exodus of woods goats and unicorns had dwindled to almost nothing, the sky a leaden grey through which the sun could not be seen. That evening he saw what he was sure would be the last band of woods goats and shot one of them. When he went to it, he was almost afraid to believe what he saw. The hair above its feet was red, discolored with the stain of iron-bearing clay. He examined it more closely, and saw that the goat had apparently watered at a spring where the mud was material washed down from an iron-bearing vein or formation. It had done so fairly recently. There were still tiny particles of clay adhering to the hair. The wind stirred, cold and damp with its warning of an approaching storm. He looked to the north, where the evening had turned the grey clouds black, and called Schroeder. Steve, any luck? None, Schroeder answered. I just killed a goat, he said. It has iron stains on its legs it got at some spring farther north. I'm going on to try to find it. You can turn back in the morning. No, Schroeder objected. I can angle over and catch up with you in a couple of days. You'll turn back in the morning, he said. I'm going to try to find this iron. But if I get caught by a blizzard, it will be up to you to tell them at the caves that I found iron, and to tell them where it is. You know the markers can't transmit that far. There was a short silence, then Schroeder said, all right, I see. I'll head south in the morning. Lake took a route the next day that would most likely be the one the woods goats had come down, stopping on each ridge top to study the country ahead of him through his binoculars. It was cloudy all day, but at sunset the sun appeared very briefly, to send its last rays across the hills and redden them in mockery of the iron he sought, far ahead of him. Small even through the glasses and made visible only because of the position of the sun, was a spot at the base of a hill that was redder than the sunset had made the other hills. He was confident it would be the red clay he was searching for, and he hurried on, not stopping until darkness made further progress impossible. Tip slept inside his jacket, curled up against his chest, while the wind blew raw and cold all through the night. He was on his way again at the first touch of daylight, the sky darker than ever and the wind spinning random flakes of snow before him. He stopped to look back to the south once, thinking, if I turn back now I might get out before the blizzard hits. Then the other thought came, these hills all look the same. If I don't go to the iron while I'm this close and know where it is, it might be years before I or anyone else could find it again. He went on and did not look back again for the rest of the day. By mid-afternoon the higher hills around him were hidden under the clouds, and the snow was coming harder and faster as the wind drove the flakes against his face. It began to snow with a heaviness that brought a half-darkness when he came finally to the hill he had seen through the glasses. A spring was at the base of it, bubbling out of red clay. Above it, the red dirt led 100 feet to a dike of granite and stopped. He hurried up the hillside that was rapidly whitening with snow and saw the vein. It set against the dike, short and narrow but red-black with the iron it contained. He picked up a piece and felt the weight of it. It was heavy, it was pure iron oxide. He called Schroeder and asked, are you down out of the high hills, Steve? I'm in the lower ones, Schroeder answered, the words coming a little muffled from where Tip lay inside his jacket. It looks black as hell up your way. I found the iron, Steve. Listen, these are the nearest to landmarks I can give you. When he had finished he said, that's the best I can do. You can't see the red clay except when the sun is low in the southwest, but I'm going to build a monument on top of the hill to find it by. About you, Howard, Steve asked, what are your chances? The wind was rising to a high moaning around the ledges of the granite dike, and the vein was already invisible under the snow. It doesn't look like they're very good, he answered. You'll probably be leader when you come back next spring. I told the council I wanted that if anything happened to me, keep things going the way I would have. Now I'll have to hurry to get the monument built in time. All right, Schroeder said. So long, Howard. Good luck. He climbed to the top of the hill and saw boulders there he could use to build the monument. They were large, he might crush Tip against his chest in picking them up, and he took off his jacket to wrap it around Tip and leave him lying on the ground. He worked until he was panting for breath, the wind driving the snow harder and harder against him, until the cold seemed to have penetrated to the bone. He worked until the monument was too high for his numb hands to lift any more boulders to its top. By then it was tall enough that it should serve its purpose. He went back to look for Tip, the ground already 4 inches deep in snow, and the darkness almost complete. Tip, he called. Tip, Tip. He walked back and forth across the hillside in the area where he thought he had left him, stumbling over rocks buried in the snow and invisible in the darkness, calling against the wind and thinking, I can't leave him to die alone here. Then from a bulge he had not seen in the snow under him, there came a frightened, lonely wail. Tip, cold, Tip, cold. He raked the snow off his jacket and unwrapped Tip to put him inside his shirt next to his bare skin. Tip's paws were like ice and he was shivering violently, the first symptom of the pneumonia that killed mockers so quickly. Tip coughed, a wrenching, rattling little sound, and whimpered, hurt, I know, he said. Your lungs hurt, damn it to hell. I wish I could have let you go home with Steve. He put on the cold jacket and went down the hill. There was nothing with which he could make a fire, only the short half-green grass, already buried under the snow. He turned south at the bottom of the hill, determining the direction by the wind, and began the stubborn march southward that could have but one ending. He walked until his cold-numbed legs would carry him no farther. The snow was warm when he fell for the last time, warm and soft as it drifted over him, and his mind was clouded with a pleasant drowsiness. This isn't so bad, he thought, and there was something like surprise through the drowsiness. I can't regret doing what I had to do, doing it the best I could. Tip was no longer coughing, and the thought of Tip was the only one that was tinged with regret. I hope he wasn't still hurting when he died. He felt Tip still very feebly against his chest then, and he did not know if it was his imagination or if in that last dreamlike state it was Tip's thought that came to him, warm and close and reassuring him. No hurt, no cold, now all right, now we sleep now. Thanks for joining me on this cosmic journey. Like and subscribe for daily sci-fi stories. Until tomorrow, keep looking up at the stars.